Welcome, everybody. It's Monday night here at Pine Island Research. Appreciate you guys joining us, choosing us out of all of your potential options to waste a Monday night. You chose us, and I am not blind to the fact that you did. I appreciate it. Welcome to everybody in chat. See a lot of familiar names rolling through. Excited for tonight's show. We have Small Town Monsters with Seth Breedlove and Alex Petikoff joining us. I know a lot of you have seen the first part of the Alaskan Coastal Sasquatch documentary that they put out. I am one who watched it immediately and was impressed. It was really well done. And I've seen Alex doing some interviews on some different channels. It's attracting a lot of attention. Obviously, the community has been turning their heads and paying attention to what was addressed in the documentary. And I think a lot of people are excited to see the second part of it come out. But not only were we able to land Alex to come on the show, I was really excited that Seth had a night free, or at least some time free, to come and talk about not only the documentary, maybe some of the challenges of shooting a documentary in that type of a landscape. And without further ado, let's bring them in. Seth and Alex, how are you guys?
Good, man. Thanks for having us.
Yeah, thank you.
Well, I appreciate you guys setting aside a little time to join us. It's exciting. I'm sure you guys have been getting a lot of feedback on the first part of the documentary that you released. What's some of the things you've been hearing?
Quite a bit, actually. I mean, lots of people asking, "Oh, where was this? What did you guys experience? What's in part two?" That's probably the most asked. The two most asked questions are probably, when is part two, and is that Portlock or Port Chatham? Which, to answer, no, it is not. It's a different location. But a lot of people know about the Port Chatham area because of, shows and previous documentaries and books that have been done on that topic. So everyone kind of assumes that's the only place in Alaska to go bigfooting, I guess.
Yeah. So, and to settle the question, when's part two coming out? I've heard that it's coming with a big bow and it's going to be under everybody's Christmas tree, right?
Yep, some nice time with the family, and then turn into YouTube and check out part two. So that'll be December 25th. So we're really excited for that. Originally it wasn't supposed to be, well, it was going to be two parts, but I was kind of toying with the idea of doing a single part, but we had filmed so much there that changed, with the 1 terabyte of footage alone just from that one location. So because the way the film was sort of linear in terms of the timeline, it made sense to split it up. Because otherwise you would have had probably a 3-hour documentary. I don't know, people maybe would have watched that, but it would have been pretty long.
Yeah. But, as far as the timeline leading up to the documentary, I mean, obviously there's a lot of preparation that goes into, a production like that, but also, it's not just about cameras and batteries and equipment and plane tickets. It's about the property owner, and it's a remote area, and everybody being able to be there and accessing it at the time the weather allows you to access it and things like that. How much preparation went into putting this together?
A good amount. I mean, I originally was reached out to by the property owner in May of 2021. So basically a full year before we went out there. And we were out at this location in May of 2022. So just this past May, all of us, Seth and the rest of the STM gang, we all kind of headed up. And then myself and Eli Watson and our buddy Ron Reed, we kind of went off to the cabin, and Seth and the rest were off doing other stuff. But yeah, it was a full year. Talking to Scott, the property owner, and kind of getting to know him, and just logistics, because it's such a remote area. There's a lot of dangers you deal with just being remote anywhere like that, let alone in a place like Alaska where you do have brown bears and, you could break a leg out there, and that's a very serious injury in such a remote place where you're over an hour boat ride from the nearest port, let alone a hospital. So there's a lot of logistics involved.
Yeah, I think that's something that that's probably one of the things that is hard to wrap your head around when you think about something that's remote like that. It's not just, you got to bring all your own food. So it's the preparation of what if things don't go right. And
Yeah, exactly.
I've got, I grew up in a family of hunting guides, and we guided in remote areas of Montana, Wyoming, Idaho, Saskatchewan, and Manitoba. But I am with a network of guides, and a lot of them are grizzly guides up in Alaska.
Yeah.
And those guys, when they go out there for, literally, I mean, the guides themselves will be out there for like 40 days, and then they'll just fly in a different client every 10 days.
Right.
But they're there for the long haul, and the amount of preparation has to go into a plan for what if something doesn't go right? What if it's not necessarily being attacked by a bear, but what if somebody does break a leg if they slip and fall off something? The extraction out of someplace like that is a project. So I'm sure you guys went in with more than just a little first aid kit in the backpack. You got to have a whole plan of how you're going to deal with something like that.
Yeah, definitely. Just to add to that, I mean, also being in a coastal area, obviously having radio contact with the Coast Guard and that sort of thing was something that we were cognizant of. Obviously, the property owner, he has kind of the equipment that was necessary to do that. So there was actually one experience we had towards the end of the trip where, we're using marine radios, which allow us to really communicate with basically anyone in the surrounding area that happens to be by with a boat. That doesn't happen that often in that particular area. Mm-hmm. But towards the end of the trip, we actually were able to listen to somebody on some sort of a boat out in the Gulf of Alaska had gotten injured, like a head injury. And we were listening to this going on in the communications between the Coast Guard dispatch and the people on the boat. It was actually really kind of an eye-opening experience. Obviously, it was kind of disturbing in some ways listening to that, but that's just the sort of thing, you're trying to race back to a place where you can get somewhere for a helicopter to land. So that's essentially, we were listening to that scenario. So I think that just sort of made it more obvious that safety is a big concern out there.
Kind of a surreal awakening, so to speak. Seth, you're pretty well known for your cinematography and your camera work. What are the challenges of shooting a production like that in that type of terrain? I mean, how many cameras are involved? I can't imagine.
Yeah, I mean, for what I was doing in Alaska is totally different from what Alex and Eli are doing, because Alex and Eli are in the as my dad was a Vietnam War veteran, they were like in the shit. If you're talking about the terrain they were dealing with, we were a completely different. I had a 5-man crew, and we were going around conducting interviews. So our challenges were very different from what Alex and Eli were dealing with. We were like driving from location to location and dealing with like scheduling changes and people backing out of interviews and that kind of thing. And I don't think we ever went anywhere that was anywhere near as sketchy as where Alex and Eli were. So I realized while we were filming Olympic, the Discover on the Trail of Bigfoot, the Discovery, and Alex was shooting the Beyond the Trail Olympic Bigfoot episode, just how different those two types of docs are. Because it's very much like what Alex and Eli are doing is very much like a true, like old school adventure film. And what I'm doing is very much like Unsolved Mysteries or something. And it's just like, it's a completely different shooting style. We're setting up, we shot 19 interviews, I think, in about 10 days. But there were so many hours of driving, from region to region, which Alex and Eli also dealt with. I'm not downplaying that, because they also dealt with that same thing too. So it was crazy for us. It was really about the scheduling and moving people around so that the day driving made sense, like to get from place to place and interview, each person. And some interviews run significantly longer than others. Like a witness will talk to us for 10 minutes. And, you'll interview an expert or like a Bigfoot aficionado from Alaska, and they'll talk for 2 hours. So it's very different. Those two styles. I mean, the biggest challenge we faced was the fact that when we landed, we were all sick. So me and my crew of 4, we were all pretty much laid up in Homer for the first like 4 days of the shoot. Like everyone in my crew was pretty ill. So that was our biggest challenge.
And just so everybody in chat understands, and those listening on the podcast after the live production here, this is all because you guys, well, typically you were working on multiple productions simultaneously. We're not just talking about the Alaskan coastal Sasquatch that you've seen Alex in.
If you lay it out, like when Alex and I dreamed up Beyond the Trail, it was going to be like a show that operated on its own until it tied into Beyond the Trail or On the Trail of Bigfoot. And at this point, I feel like they're just running side by side rather than anything tying into anything. This one though, they are very, very much intertwined. I would say if you want the like boots on the ground, crazy, guys in the field having really wild experiences, that's worth tuning in to Alex and Eli's for. And for On the Trail of Bigfoot, what we're going to do is lay out the entire history of the Sasquatch phenomenon in the state of Alaska across 2 films. So the first is On the Trail of Bigfoot, The Last Frontier, and the second will be On the Trail of Bigfoot, The Land of the Missing. But the cool thing about that is a lot of what comes through the lore and the native legends and witness stories is expanded greatly upon by what Alex and Eli either actually experienced themselves or interviewed people on, at the property at Area A that experienced similar things. So you're going to get a heck of a lot of context within Last Frontier and Land of the Missing, and then really narrow that down when you get into what Beyond the Trail, Alaskan coastal Sasquatch does.
Yeah, that's how I've seen it all. Honestly, I feel like we micro focus on a single case, as in this case, obviously that property, whereas Seth is showing the more broader picture in Alaska. And what was so interesting was, we were having stuff happening to us and to the folks that we were speaking with that simultaneously Seth and the crew were hearing from other witnesses, particularly from the native Alaskan, Native American tribes, and they were going on completely separate of one another. I mean, these people weren't associated, but this is just something you come across, and something I'm referring to is especially is the baby crying kind of stuff. And that I think is one of the more interesting tie-ins between the two as well.
Yeah, that comes up first in Last Frontier through a native woman this happened in like 1969 on an island, a literal island. One of the what are those? The Aleutians. She was on an island called Onalaska, and she actually heard like the baby crying and stuff like that. But that comes back throughout the movie, and then it'll really come into focus with Land of the Missing. But yeah, it's always awesome. The coolest thing to me is seeing what Alex and Eli do and how it kind of like it feeds into like the same thing happened with Olympic Bigfoot, but it's just on such a larger scale with this one, and hopefully informs kind of what we're going to do going forward. Because I know our next big plan is to go to British Columbia sometime next year together. So we'll hopefully get into this kind of thing again.
I think that's really interesting how the storylines from those different productions can correlate in that way, to where it's almost like you're hearing it talked about and shared through these stories and accounts, and then you're actually getting a taste of it in what's happening to Alex and his group as they're out there. And like you say, the baby crying and the woman's voices, these are things that you hear often, not just in Alaska, but in throughout Canada and the lower 48 as well, as in many encounters. It's intriguing, but there's certain things that when I hear about in encounters, or I hear about people drawing theories in research that seem kind of geographically limited. Like you'll hear about things that happen in Florida that maybe you don't hear about happening in Washington State, tendencies, and but that is something. The woman's voices and the baby crying sounds. I don't think there's a geographical limit on where you see these taking place. That seems to be something that is a common thread, so to speak.
Well, the baby crying thing, especially, the first time I encountered that was actually on the Chestnut Ridge in Pennsylvania. That was like the Chestnut Ridge was really connected to that baby crying thing back during the 70s, especially. So just pointing that out.
So my eyes asked Seth, in your interviews, have you heard any stories that surprised you? And I would imagine that to some degree. I mean, they all come with an element of surprise or mystique and intrigue, but were there any of them that you encountered up there that just kind of like blew you away or stand monumental in your mind?
If we're relegating it to just this project, to the Alaska stuff, the one that came to mind, it might not surprise most people who are into like witness stories. I think what people are looking for with witness stories anymore is something that's so crazy that it just blows your mind. But we interviewed a guy at Rob Roy's Bigfoot Art Gallery who had like an emotional breakdown like toward the end of his interview. And it's going to be in the last on the Trail of Bigfoot, the Last Frontier trailer. It'll be featured in the movie, but it's kind of like a blink and you'll miss it witness story. But behind the scenes, like that one really took me by surprise, because I had a sighting myself last year. And this guy was snowmobiling somewhere. And he had seen a Bigfoot, and then he saw other Bigfoot, and then the sky turned purple. Like all this stuff happened that sounded really outlandish, but the longer he talked, I was and I hate to like put words in his mouth or like psychoanalyze the guy, but the way it read to me was he had an encounter that was actually really similar to mine, where he's just moving through the woods. He sees this thing, his brain's trying to process it, and then it just kind of breaks down for a minute and everything goes crazy. Like he's saying the sky turned purple and time stopped. But I believe him. I actually 100% believe him that he saw something, and then his brain, while trying to process what it was encountering, just flipped the script on him, and stuff happened after that he still isn't quite clear on how it happened or what happened. But he was so emotional. That was the most emotional like Bigfoot witness that I've ever talked to, and it hit me just because I understood where he was at in that moment. And he was a nice guy. He's a totally normal guy, no interest in Bigfoot, by the way. This isn't like a subject that he's into. It just happened, and it totally shifted his world, apparently in literally for a little while. So that was probably the one that really hit me. I mean, that native woman who encountered one on Alaska was really wild. It's one of my favorite witness stories, just because she's 80, she's in her 80s now, late 80s. And I managed to get this in the movie, but she says at the very beginning of the interview that she's just glad she is able to share it, because she's held on to it, like her whole life. And she said she was just glad to be able to share it before she passed. Like that was how she put it. And I thought that was it was a really, her also, the details she remembered of what she saw, it's so detailed, so like etched in her memory that she like talked about the wrinkles in the skin and how its eyes were bloodshot from the wind and stuff, like like just like really, really intense details that I thought were really telling as to her.
I think that's interesting that she sees her encounter as really part of her legacy. Like she didn't want to die unheard, you know.
Mhm.
And I also think that the psychology of, you know, what your mind does in the process. I mean, there's two people need to really grasp the idea that there's when there's encounters, I would throw them in two. There's not by standard, but there is a way to classify. There are those people who got involved in the community, educated themselves on whatever they could on the subject, and whether they're a researcher or whether they're an investigator or just somebody who loves the outdoors and this is a passion for them, their encounter came on the backside of that. And then there's those who had an encounter when they didn't know diddly crap about Bigfoot. And it maybe spurred them to try to learn more after it, to try to make sense of it. I myself fall in that second category. I mean, I went a long time after I first had my encounter before I was like, man, I really want to try to understand what happened. That like why and why would it? How did that come about? And I think that there's so much that goes on in somebody's head in that second category of people who don't have a threshold of reference, so to speak, in their head when they're having an encounter. They don't know anything about this. They never even heard that these things are real. Maybe they caught a glimpse of the PG film on a movie trailer when they were 8 years old, you know, or something like that. But they never spent any time putting real thought towards it. And I just finished writing a book, and part of that book, I interviewed Leon Thompson, who works in the psychology field and deals with, you know, PTSD inducement moments. And it's really fascinating when you learn about somebody who doesn't have that threshold of reference, what is happening in their head. When you're on like you say, Seth, when you're on a snowmobile going through the woods and you see something like that, your mind immediately starts going through a check down list of what it isn't. I know it's not this. It's not a bear. It stays on its back legs. It's not this. It's not a moose. It's not a person. It's too big. There's too much body mass. And the more things you check off, the more it leaves you with this idea that this is chaotic. I can't make sense of this. And your senses, people sometimes ask me, well, did it make any vocalizations when I share my encounter thing? I'm like, you know, I can't say that it didn't, because I am so locked in trying to make sense of what's going on that I may have been desensitized a little bit as to, was there a sound made, you know? But as you explain these interviews and these encounters that were shared with you, you see a lot of that trying to make sense of things. And sometimes it's not in the story. Sometimes it's not the story that's surprising or fascinating. It's the way that it's told. It's the emotion that's being shared while it's being told. And that's really what makes it feel genuine. It could be outlandish. It could be like almost too hard to wrap your mind around. But when you see how it affected that person and how they're reacting to sharing it with you, you realize this is a real I mean, this person believes that this is what they experienced, obviously. But
Yeah.
So fascinating. Also, I'm really excited about the interviews that you conducted, Seth. It's interesting because you're not just conducting them with the indigenous people of those tribes there that have, you know, lore and history for centuries passed down. But you're talking about hunting guides and all kinds of people who when they share those encounters, you start seeing all these similarities weaving together, so to speak. What do you intend to get more stories, or are you going to base a production on what you've gathered so far?
Oh no, no. I mean, we ended up with close to 20 interviews. Most of them in Alaska. Outside of Alaska, the only one I ended up with was Cliff. I interviewed Cliff Barrickman while he was actually out in Minerva with me shooting an episode of YouTube series I do. And I interviewed him about Alaska Bigfoot lore, just to kind of weigh in on his, as an outsider, like his perspective on it. But no, I mean, we ended up with so many interviews. For us, 20 interviews is a ton. Typical STM movie will have like eight or nine interviews. We were, as we were shooting these interviews, by the way, originally under the impression that this was just for one movie, and as time went on, it became apparent that there was a bigger story at play that we were starting to expand on. And by like day 3 or 4 of doing interviews, I was pushing a lot of the interviews in the direction that things were clearly starting to lead. So what happened is that The Last Frontier was conceived as being, On the Trail of Bigfoot, The Last Frontier was conceived as being a really like widespread, broad look at the history of Bigfoot in Alaska, with some, so like you're going to start with the native legends, you're going to kind of like move through time, you're going to get all this insight into not just Bigfoot there, but also the history of the state and that kind of thing. And then what happened is by like day 3, we kept hearing these things about the themes seem to be if you hear whistling in the woods, don't go in the woods, baby crying, don't go out in the woods, missing people kept popping up. And so by day 3 or 4, I had Heather, who's our researcher, Heather Mosier. She's the Small Town Monsters researcher. I had her looking directly into like, can you track down people while we're here who either have a connection to missing persons cases, or can expand on missing people in Alaska, or if not going in that direction, go more into the area of like the really dark side of Sasquatch in Alaska. Because a lot of what we were hearing was not your typical like a random encounter on a dark road at night. It was like there was a much more sinister undertone to it, which Alex can probably speak to as well. But we kept pushing further in that direction, while also doing what we had originally intended to do, which was tell the history of Bigfoot in Alaska. And we kept finding those two things were really intertwined. And so that the sheer volume of interviews we ended up with was pretty impressive, but the stories get really, really, really wild in Land of the Missing, especially because you go in some really unexpected directions with Last Frontier, but Land of the Missing, we have a story from a guy who tells a story about being holed up in a cabin and firing shots at one of these things, and like it's like ripping pieces of the cabin off. it gets wow. Intense in the second movie. And then there's also like the Chris McCandless connection from Into the Wild, which I know Alex is diving into as well. So and we lucked out. We actually got the film for Land of the Missing. We filmed I can't remember I think it's the opening dialogue scene where Alex, Eli, and I are talking for the first time. That one was shot on Stampede Trail, right around the same location where Chris McCandless would have actually been dropped off. So Land of the Missing will kind of open at that location, which is really an interesting tie to missing people in Alaska, even though I'm not connecting McCandless to like being abducted by Bigfoot or anything, but there's an interesting connection there.
Well, and that's what I was going to ask you about is, one of the things that we've seen over the last few years is the awareness that was brought forth with, David Pilates talking about the missing 411 and other YouTube influencers that are out there, and book writers, authors like, Steve Stockton, bringing a lot of views to the missing in all over, all areas all over the United States and Canada. But there's a staggering amount of missing persons cases in Alaska. And, for a long time, I kind of looked at that number and felt like, well, if you've ever been there, you've ever truly been in remote wilderness similar to that, you'd understand that there's a lot of reasons why somebody could go missing. If you get injured and you are immobile and you don't have the proper communication, you're probably going to get eaten in 72 hours by something. I mean, there's just so many ways a person's demise could come about. But on the post side of doing the documentary that you just released, the first part of it, and hearing these in-person accounts up there, do you put more weight into the fact that the Sasquatch phenomena could actually have a significant impact on the number of missing cases there are?
I'm interested to hear Alex's take on this, honestly, but my take on it has shifted somewhat. I think that there is the odd case of missing people that might have a Bigfoot connection. I don't think it's common.
No.
I think it's very rare, actually. But I think it's these things are real. Like, we're pretty sure they're real. I'm pretty sure they're real. And if they're real and they're they're an animal, which is my personal opinion. It's totally possible that the odd person could be taken by these things or killed by these things, and the body never discovered, especially in a place as remote as Alaska. When you're talking about missing people in Alaska, the number is so high. I don't think a lot of that is Bigfoot attributable, but the odd case definitely could be. I did notice someone in the chat had said something about McCandless and what connection is there to Bigfoot. It's already, I think Alex has already discussed it. I'm not sure if it made it in. I can't remember if it made it.
Yeah, it was in our video.
Yeah.
I mean, essentially the connection, and it's sort of a bit of, I don't want to say it's a stretch, but the same year, I believe it was 1993 or 92 when Chris McCandless died. That was the year when he essentially went out in kind of late spring and basically was dead early or late summer, kind of early fall, September time period. Died of starvation and possibly of eating toxic kind of berries or plants that he shouldn't have been eating. That was the cause of death. But that same year, there were 3 reports filed with the national park, so Denali National Park, of vandalism of these remote cabins that were 7 miles from where Chris McCandless was found in the bus. There were these cabins that were there that were essentially used by dog sled teams, refueling stations. They'd keep food and wood stoves and that kind of stuff there. I believe one was a private owner that owned one of the cabins, and the 2 others were organizations. I don't think any of them were owned by the federal government, but the federal government, in the National Park Service, took the report. These cabins were found ransacked to the point where literally the wood stoves had been removed and placed outside. Metal sheeting 7 feet high off the ground was bent inwards. There was just rampant vandalism. The carpets were all ripped out. The mattresses were outside. None of the food was gone, which was the unusual part. So it was indicated that it was most likely human activity. And there was actually some speculation that Chris McCandless had done that vandalism, which at the time didn't make a lot of sense because he would have been extremely emaciated. This, I believe, happened in August or July. So a month or 2 before his passing, he already would have been sub 100 pounds and starving. Yeah. Why he would hike 7 miles to a location, ransack cabins,
or even if he'd be capable. I mean,
he wouldn't be able. Yeah, he wouldn't be able to move a wood stove that size in his situation all by himself. So, one of the researchers we spoke up to in the Denali area kind of implied he thought perhaps there could have been some Bigfoot connection to the ransacking because there was no food taken. So, I mean, that's the connection there.
It was, yeah. I mean, the guy that told us this too was a Denali. I mean, at the time, Mount McKinley or McKinley National Park. He was. What was his position? He actually was like one of the people that worked within the park, but he was like a head of something within the national park. I don't know why I don't remember this because I just did his lower third like a month ago. But he this was coming from someone. Oh, and he had the paperwork too.
He gave us the report. We have the full report. One of the reports filed by the private landowner. Yeah. And I tried to contact actually the cabin owner. I tried to contact the gentleman who owned it through his wife, and it was kind of a bit of a hostile interaction when I got the number and made the call. So we left it at that. But
Well, one of the things that you mentioned, Seth, that I would agree with is that, the number of missing persons cases in Alaska is high. It's a staggering number. But, when you hear I shouldn't say experts, when you hear people in this community who have put a tremendous amount of thought and maybe some scientific method towards their efforts in guesstimating what would a population size look like as far as if this creature exists, and what areas would they be higher in numbers and whatnot. I've heard people try to put accurate guesstimates towards it. And when you look at those numbers, whether it's the low range or the high range, when you factor in the number of bears and the number of mountain lions, and you look at every state and province's DNR reports on estimated population size of those, we're talking about literally thousands to one as far as predators that could kill a human being versus Sasquatch. So when you say, I think it would be unlikely, it not saying that it couldn't happen, but it wouldn't be likely. I would agree with that. I would say even out of that staggering number of missing people cases, it would be a stretch to imagine that the Sasquatch would be responsible for a significant number of those.
We would know they were there.
Yeah, I mean, at that point,
this has always been my biggest argument against massive numbers of people going missing due to Sasquatch is, if that's the case, and you'll probably get pushback in the comments or whatever, because this is, but if this was happening and droves of people were going missing due to Sasquatch, we would know they were there. We would already, there'd be definitive proof we'd know.
We would have hunted them down, tried to kill them.
Yeah.
I mean,
it's also what the DNRs are capable of. I mean, we're talking about, we're likely talking about a species whose number one goal is to be elusive, remain somewhat undiscovered, and, a lot like mountain lions in the way they interact with humans. 99 out of 100 mountain lions will run like hell from a human. They don't want anything to do with you. Now, you come by on a mountain bike or you come by jogging down a trail, go try it with your domestic house cat who naps 23 hours a day. Tie a feather to a fishing string and drag it across a room and watch what it triggers him to do when you send him into a pursuit mode. It is a natural instinct. There are going to be times when humans may trigger a natural instinct like that and invoke a confrontation that maybe doesn't turn out favorable for the human. But is it common? No. And you take a species that's as elusive as a cougar or mountain lions are, and yet DNRs all over the country and throughout Canada and Alaska are able to give you pretty good guesstimates as to their population sizes, even though they're extremely hard to come in contact with. So, to what Seth's point of view, I mean, look, if they were responsible for a significant amount of these missing person cases, how would we not have better evidence that they're there to begin with?
Or a reaction, a violent reaction. I think, it would be turned into one of those kind of pitchfork situations. I mean, this happens in countries in Africa where crocodiles will go on killing sprees and massacre people. And what happens? Your family member gets killed by some animal, or in India, the local tiger starts eating children. People get in large numbers and track an animal down that may be very powerful, but still they're using numbers to kill this thing. And I think a lot of people turn to some of the native folklore from Alaska and other places about, the natives talk about Sasquatches or hairy men, whatever the legend is, Jonaqua, being some sort of a thing that eats children, or it steals women. It's a cannibal giant. All you need is that to happen once. Let's say there was one instance where a Sasquatch kidnapped somebody, and that becomes kind of part of the lore. Then that is also used as a boogeyman. Or maybe somebody just went up in the mountains, fell off a cliff, and was never seen again. And there's already a legend of the hairy man in the area. So that gets then lumped in and says, well, the hairy man is responsible for killing this person, and that becomes part of the lore. You really only need one instance,
Yeah.
or even just a sort of assumption that was the case for it to become part of legend and lore. And I think that's a common thread throughout human history and various cultures, with strange creatures we're not familiar with, and associating mystical powers or things that don't really make sense if you actually think about them, but we try to rationalize them when we maybe don't have enough information.
I think that's also interesting about indigenous people and tribes is that you're talking about a population of people who have been in that area for centuries upon centuries. They weren't displaced. One of the things that I had came across in working on the Blood Run documentary is that, throughout the Midwest and northern states in the U.S. and even the parts of the Saskatchewan and Manitoba, is that so many of these tribes, they based their locations and their settlements on resources. And when those resources ran out, they would move. And when they moved usually into an uncomfortable closeness to another tribe. And it was a violent landscape. I mean, most tribes through a lot of the United States weren't there for hundreds of years. They've been displaced. They've moved. And one of the things that we noticed is through the geological and the anthropological findings on the Blood Run site was that a lot of these tribes were learning about their history based on what these universities were uncovering. Like, this is where you guys were 320 years ago. They're like, oh, news to us, But that's because when you're displaced, it's harder to maintain a tribe's history. You just don't bring those things with you, Right. Whereas when you look at the Seneca tribe in New York and stuff, I mean, they were there forever, And so you're in an area with the Kenai Peninsula where a lot of those indigenous people, we're talking not just generations, but we're talking centuries of stories and lore that are pretty well maintained amongst their people. And so I think when you hear indigenous people saying, there's stories that my grandmother told, there's something to it when they've been there that long, right, and not displaced, But I'm really excited to hear more about those interviews as they come, as the production gets closer. I think a lot of people are going to be excited when they see that, because, like you say, not only does it run in correlation with the production you just released, but to some degree, it may be even more revealing in the information that we glean from it and learn from it.
Yeah, I don't know how to put that in a way that makes it. I don't know. I can just tell you from behind the scenes, it's extremely exciting because Alex and I have been working together since 2016. Is that 2017, 2016, something like that?
2017-ish, yeah, something like that.
I mean, it's been a process, but we never had worked together in tandem where we're both creating something. Alex has been on multiple SDM crews. He was on the Momo crew. He was on the Trail of UFOs, but to actually create stuff together. I mean, honestly, just with Small Town Monsters in general, that's my favorite aspect of all of this is when we're creating things in tandem or creating things in collaboration with one another. But this one's been, I don't know, this one's on another level, because even as I'm editing it, I'll see things mentioned in the doc on the trail in like Last Frontier that is expanded upon in what Alex is doing. But on a ground level, like on a boots on, it's I don't know how to put it in a way that doesn't. I would probably like weirdly put it in a way that would sound insulting to my own thing, or like weirdly insulting to Alex's, but it's just different levels to the way I always put it is on the Trail of Bigfoot will give context, and then Alex will narrow that down to a degree that you'll see it for yourself play out, either through evidence or eyewitness encounters or whatever that he's gonna lay out, and be on the trail. And so that's what that's the thing I'm most excited about. And then apparently, like, so on the Trail of Bigfoot, Last Frontier comes out in January. I think it's January 17th, which is after both of the Alaskan Coastal Sasquatch episodes come out. But then Land of the Missing will come out next June or July, somewhere around then. And then Alex is making a return trip to Alaska sometime next spring. And so there's going to be more coming that'll tie back into the Land of the Missing, I'm sure. So it's apparently going to be an ongoing. We might just start doing everything in Alaska.
Yeah, there's a
Scenery alone, that works.
pretty good to-do list you've got put together there right now.
Yeah. So, I mean, we'll be going up in the summertime because Eli and myself are going to be going to be speakers at the Boreal Bigfoot Expo in Fairbanks, Alaska, which is further north than we made it on this trip. And what I'm really excited about, and one of the reasons I really like events, is hearing stories from people in the local areas. You know, I'm not from Alaska. I'm not going to assume I know everything about Alaska or the Sasquatch stories up there. Obviously, that's ridiculous. But a chance like that is to meet locals who have had experiences, who maybe can get you onto other leads, or, you know, you may have experienced something in the field or, you know, through an interview that you then talk to another person that essentially tells you the same thing. It's sort of like a corroborating kind of confirmation sort of detail. So I'm really excited for that, but we will be definitely going back out to the same location, you know, codename Area A, or the cabin as we sort of call it. And we're just trying to expand upon some of the stuff that that's going on out there, because I mean, the moment I heard about it, I thought it was a very compelling case. And you know, I think there's few locations like that in the country where you really have just the right amount of factors. You have the remoteness, the viability of the habitat, the history there. I mean, the purpose of that cabin was a fishing cabin for leisure and time off.
Let's come here and relax, right?
Yeah, none of these guys expected this, I mean, at all. So in their quest for answers, they've reached out to folks like us. I mean, they've talked to folks like Doug and the Olympic Project and others as well that, you know, have obviously been in it for a while. So it's just the right kind of factors, I think, that hopefully we could walk away with something fascinating. Obviously, I'm not going to assume we are, but I think if there is a place for something like that to exist, that location and just other parts of Alaska too are, I mean, they have everything you possibly want in a potential Sasquatch habitat.
Buy a place in Alaska, they said. Relax, roast some s'mores in the night.
Get a rock thrown at you.
Stuff will scream at you and throw stuff at you.
It's not the bears, right? So it's fascinating. It's been one of the most interesting cases I've had the chance to work on, and I mean, in arguably one of the most beautiful places on earth, Alaska. I mean, it outclasses everything. I think there's that John Muir quote about "Don't go to Alaska as a young man because it will ruin everything else for you." It's pretty true, I have to say.
I think somebody had mentioned to you, wow, it must have been hard to capture those whales on the drone, and you were like, actually, that was one of the easier things to capture.
It was, yeah.
They're just happening all around you, you know.
Mountain goats, everything. I mean,
Seth, I know you had mentioned that you weren't sure if you were able to stay much past the first hour, and I want you to know I appreciate you taking the time and talking to us. Whenever you've got to jump out, I totally understand. But
yeah, I can hang for like 7 minutes, maybe. I have a 5-year-old that wakes up really easily if I don't get in there at a certain time. So yeah,
that's probably almost as big of a mystery as the Sasquatch mystery is how do you get a kitchen pass to go to Alaska with a 5-year-old? That's good time management, I guess, as far as trying to figure out how all those places. I say that because I've got boys that are 17 and 18 years old, and there was a point in my life where it was like having a boat anchor strapped to each leg every time I tried to.
No, I mean, he's grown up with it. Like he was born in 2017, which is the year this really kicked off. Like STM really took off in 2017, I always say. So like he's been used to it, but as I get older, I try to schedule my trips around him now, so it's a little different. In the earliest days, it was like I love traveling, but I do find that the older he gets, the more time I just want to be around him for all that, and bring him into it. Like I'm taking it. My big goal this year or next year in 2023, I want to take him to the Olympic Peninsula. It's one of my favorite places, but the Olympic Project people, like Derek and Shane and those guys, I genuinely don't think those guys know how much they as human beings mean to me, but they like some of the nicest people I've ever known.
Amazing.
And so I wanted, like, I seriously want, like, one of my goals for, through all this has always been to get back out there and take Tommy to meet them. So next year, that's like one of my big things is to take him out there and hopefully have him see a little bit of the country. He hasn't seen big mountains, as he refers to them. And so I want him to see some of the mountains there. He's seen like the Smokies and stuff like that, but he hasn't seen, he hasn't seen West Coast mountains. So I'm excited to get him out there and see what Daddy does a little bit.
Yeah, that'll be cool. That'll be awesome. When you talk about the type of people that we meet, in whether we're working on a documentary or whether we're conducting research or investigation, it's really a testimony to a lot of the type of people that we run into in this community. I mean, you hear about the horror stories, right? Everybody wants to talk about the hoaxes and the type A personalities, but yet there are some really genuine people out there. And, I sense that about you too, Seth, is that, when you listen to, like when you're in Alaska and you listen to 1920 people tell you their stories. I mean, most of them opening themselves up to share with you one of the worst days in their life as far as being able to deal with it. And you don't just tell anybody about that. I mean, I think it's your genuine personality and your demeanor that makes people comfortable enough to open up and share stuff like that. And I think that's a big testimony to the type of person that you are too. So.
Oh, yeah, I appreciate that. Alex can't even look at the screen. He's trying not to laugh at the. No, I appreciate that. I always, I did like newspaper reporting before this. So like, that's the only, I was never a people person until that gig. So that's the thing where I finally like learned how to talk to people in a way. So that was like the thing that, also like one thing I'm finding now is since I actually had an encounter of my own, I can at least put myself in the shoes of the people we're interviewing in a way that I couldn't before. And the thing I most identify with are the people who are like, I think I'm crazy, or like, maybe I'm crazy and I didn't, cause I've had this discussion with Alex. I think I've second guessed my own encounter to the point where I'm like, maybe I didn't see anything. Like I have no idea. But so when I talk to people and people are telling me that, I connect with that on a level that I never did before. And I think I can talk to people a little bit more one-on-one about their encounters more so than maybe I used to be able to do. Cause that's how I feel about my own sighting is like,
I can relate to that. I think that, one of the most enjoyable things to do is, when you get an opportunity to go to a conference, whether you're speaking at it or whether you're there promoting something, and you share your experience with somebody, that's one thing. I mean, that's 45 minutes of telling somebody what happened to you. The most interesting thing is the following 6 to 8 hours where people are lining up telling you what happened to them. And even when it comes to things like, I'm a flesh and blood researcher. I have to believe that I'm chasing a flesh and blood creature and trying to learn about a flesh and blood creature. Not saying that it doesn't have supernatural capabilities, but I haven't unveiled that in my research yet. But when somebody sits down and says, let me tell you what happened to me, it could have been a dog man or something. And I'm thinking, oh boy, here we go. Right. I don't think that anymore. I mean, when somebody comes up to me and says, this happened to me, I want to tell you about it, I'm cracking a beer and I'm sitting down saying, I'm ready. I want to hear what you have to say. Just because it didn't happen to me doesn't mean that, one, it's not real, or two, that at the least, you believe this happened to you. maybe you're mistaken. Maybe it's a misidentification. Maybe you were, not having the best day that day when it comes to your mental capacity. But if you believe it happened to you, I have to be respectful to the fact that I can't sit here and say just because it didn't happen to me, there's no way, So I think that's something that is interesting to hear you share when you say that your experience has led you to be able to listen to other people share their experience without trying to prejudge where something's going to go,
Yeah. Yeah. No. Well, connecting, I mean, Alex knows this too, but like connecting with anyone you're interviewing, whether it's a witness or a researcher or whatever, that's the biggest part of it. Because if you're sitting there just asking questions, all you're going to get is kind of the prepackaged, especially from researchers.
Right.
All you're going to get are the prepackaged answers, and that's the last thing I'm looking for. And that goes all the way back to Minerva Monster and Beast of Whitehall. Like the last thing I want to do is just kind of have someone recite stuff that they've already said on camera 100 times. And I understand, like, when people talk that way, there's nothing premeditated about it. It's not an indicator that they're lying or they're making something up or they're, it's that they've done it so many times. It's kind of like ingrained in their memory and they know how to do that. But I really value when I can talk to someone and get them out of that. And I think I think that's the most important as independent filmmakers go. Anyone that's trying to do anything on film or YouTube, whatever it is, that's the thing you got to get away from. I would really, really stress that with like people who are trying to get into this, because you've already got a billion Travel Channel history documentaries, that with people kind of reciting this stuff over and over. So if you can get away from that there's a reason, by the way, that YouTube shows that are just a witness talking to the camera for like an hour, there's a reason why those shows do really well. And it's that it's not necessarily that like an audience loves sitting there through what probably should be edited down somewhat, but an audience respects authenticity. Yeah. And I know that, and the Bigfoot community especially has been talked down to by Hollywood for about 30-40 years,
and still to this day goes on to this day.
Yeah, it still goes on. All the hoax stuff that you see on TV and all that kind of stuff. So if you can get away from that and just do something authentic, I think that's really important, and connect with the people, and that all starts with you on a personal level, connecting with the person you're interviewing. Is what I'm trying to say.
Getting them to open up too, I mean, I think is a big part of it, because I've had this happen where I got to know somebody a little bit and they tell me their story beforehand, making them comfortable. They'll tell me their story beforehand, and then as soon as the cameras are on, they almost they get kind of deer in the headlights sort of thing, where they sort of, it's not as vivid as the first time they told me, because they're not as comfortable. So you have to, I've done that with interviews and then realized, well, man, maybe I should have made more of an effort to kind of assume this person doesn't know how this works. I'm used to just, okay, set up and let's get going. So it's sort of a learning process, because you're dealing with people. You're dealing with people with, as we've talked about before, possibly traumas from some of these encounters, or just they've been made fun of or ridiculed for so long that the idea of telling in front of a camera suddenly becomes a mental barrier, as opposed to telling you 5 minutes before the interview. So
my trick on even on this project, because we interviewed so many people, and so many of the people, 90%, like most of the people, I don't know, other than Cliff, I don't know how many of these people have been on camera. But the trick for me became, I was getting to the point where I wasn't even having them say their name to the camera, because I didn't want them to remember they were on camera. So I just try to like get them right into talking about, I'd be like, I'd give like a visual cue to the crew to like start filming. I'd get them talking about something completely unrelated to Bigfoot, or like, like what the weather was like, or what, like what's your favorite memory, of like the Alaskan wilderness or whatever. Like get them just talking, and then ease them into whatever the topic of the interview was. It's tricky, but there's ways
Well,
to go.
Alex, you have a channel on YouTube. I mean, I'm sure you can relate to this. I mean, I remember the first time that I had Doug Hychek on as a guest on my show before I joined his Untold Radio Network here is, I'm thinking, well, what do I want to ask him? Well, I know what I don't want to ask him. I don't want to ask him every question he's been asked on every interview that he's done, and, I've had people ask me before, well, would you want to interview Cliff Barackman? Would you want to interview? And part of me wants, as interesting as it would be, part of me wants to say, no, that's a hard interview the way I would want to do it. Because I've got to come up with a list of questions in my mind that he hasn't been asked before. And I want to get perspective that he hasn't shared before on something. And if you can't do that, you're just phoning it in like the last guy did, I'm sure you've sensed that with some of the guests you get on. I mean, you don't want to approach that interview the same way that the last 3 or 4 appearances that he did.
Yeah, I mean, I've done when I've interviewed folks, whether it's for the live stream format, kind of like this. I mean, obviously, it's different than when you're interviewing a witness or somebody on a location. But one of my kind of tricks is to sort of not really script many questions. I really don't go very prepared into an interview. I'll have the basic stuff, but what I really like, especially about some of these long format conversations, is you just let it go into a certain direction, and then from there you kind of just make stuff up. And I've done that with plenty of interviews too. Like we'll be out, especially with researchers, I find this works. We'll be in a location. Let's say, an example, we were in West Virginia with Les Odell, who's a fantastic researcher out there. Awesome guy.
Great guy.
Yeah, fantastic guy. And, I'll ask him just a couple questions about, well, can you tell me about this area and how, geographically, if you're not from West Virginia, explain the Monongahela National Forest to me or whatever. And then from there, I can get him to talk about specific encounters he's had or specific reports he's taken. Whereas if we were in a studio or, filming somewhere other than on that location, I might not think of that in the moment to talk about, well, that meadow right there is where you heard that roar from. Can you expand upon that? That sort of thing. So I find that those in-person or in-location interviews for me, especially with researchers, are a little bit easier, I think, than kind of in a more structured setting. But that's just me personally. And we're usually, like, most of our interviews are in the woods. So we do it definitely differently that way.
That's what I'm saying about the differences in production. It's just totally the challenges Alex faces are completely. The other big one is just sheer scope of like the amount of footage. I'm still not clear on how Alex and Eli managed to keep up with the amount of footage they're shooting. When we were here, we shot something like, or Alex or Alaska, we shot something like 32 hours of footage. So all the interviews, the B-roll. So you'd go back to like the hotel or the Airbnb at night or whatever, and you'd sit at a table and dump footage for like 4 hours. And there's no way they're doing that out in the woods, really. So I don't know.
A lot of SD cards.
Yeah, it's just a completely different. The challenges are really unique. But I am going to take off so I can get to bed with my kid. But
well, Seth, it was awesome having you on the show, and I loved hearing, your perspective. You've got me on the edge of my seat waiting for January 17th. I'm ready for that documentary to come out, as well as the second part of the documentary you're dumping on Christmas Day. So I think everybody's looking forward to that. Alex, are you able to stick around for a little bit and chat here?
Yeah, absolutely.
Perfect.
Awesome. Thanks for having me, guys.
You bet. It was great having us, Seth. Yeah, that was boy, I'll tell you what, I could talk to him for a long time. But he brings up a good point in that, when we talk about your opportunity to interview somebody, or another interesting parallel to that is I had been having some talks with Doug and some others about establishing, we've been thinking out loud about doing an Untold conference or something like that. It's just in the brainstorming stages, but what would it look like? What would you want? And, as much as I love Cliff Barackman and I love listening to those guys, I don't want it to be, I wouldn't want to have 4 or 5 or 6 keynote speakers that are the same ones that you see at all the conferences. I would want it to
kind
feel
of circuit,
distinct totally different. Still intriguing, still informative, but a different flavor altogether, you know?
Yeah, I mean, I think I'll do a shameless plug here, but we're doing this STM Monster Fest event in the first weekend in June in Canton, Ohio, and what we're trying to do is, you know, we do have folks like Cliff and others that have the sort of name recognition, but also some of the local researchers. I mean, you've got people like Amy Boo and others, Stan
Yeah.
Gordon, folks that are known for their sort of regional work, also bringing in people who are more from the podcast realm, and, you know, allowing them to kind of do their thing, because a lot of people get into this topic. I know I've noticed people more my age group get into this topic because of podcasts. You know, maybe they heard Astonishing
Absolutely.
Legends, and that's, you know, I get that all the time from folks. So that's pretty interesting. But I think overall, just having the ability to connect with folks at these events is, as we've talked about, you know, just part of the awesomeness of it, because you don't get that venue all the time in your day-to-day life. I mean, we all have these virtual friends. You know, I know you're in the Midwest, I'm in the Northeast, people in Alaska. You know, I talk to these folks a lot, but it's one thing to come together, you know, share a beer together and tell a story, or just get into some shenanigans or something that kind of comes with something like a conference. So I think they're a great sort of meeting of the mind. A lot of people don't like them. They think they're they get, you know, overly commercialized. And that is true to some extent, depending on the event, for sure. I've seen ones that, you know, the more paranormal leaning ones I've been to, where it's ghosts, UFOs, everything. And it's not really my cup of tea. I prefer more
you know, and
cryptids.
I would probably draw that similarity between, you know, with the Untold Network itself that I'm a part of now, is that, you know, I approach the subject of Sasquatch in a real, you know, nuts and bolts type of way.
Right.
I don't hide a whole lot as far as what my thoughts are on something, but yet I don't speak factually about things that aren't fact. And there's very few facts in this subject, you know?
Right. You
However,
have a lot of assumptions.
There are shows on different nights of the week that appeal to other parts of the paranormal more than and you see that. I mean, if you, even outside of our network, if I was to go on, you know, a show where, you know, if you go on, let's say you hop on Spaced Out Radio, you know, on a night when they got a UFO guy on, and so you mentioned something about Sasquatch in the chat, half of them are like, Sasquatch, you know, I mean,
right.
You know, it's just like they've got their corner that they exist in.
Sure.
Me, from an entertainment value, I am intrigued by all of these areas, because I do believe that not talking about whether something's real or not, I will acknowledge that ghosts, UFOs, alien life, even subjects like orbs and things. I mean, they're a real phenomena. I mean, there are all of these reports that are happening, and I don't have answers. I'm not versed in those areas, but I am entertained to hear people's perspectives and their thoughts on it. I don't go in with a thumbs up and a thumbs down judgment of it, because I don't know that I have a clear enough understanding as to even where my own ideas of what would be possible and what aren't. But, you know, it pops on our network here. There are people come in and say, look, I could watch this 7 nights a week. I love all these shows. There are other people who say, I'm for the 2 or 3 shows about Bigfoot, and the other ones I can care less about. I get that not every area of the paranormal is everybody's cup of tea, but I also believe that people, even in these bigger conferences that you do see different subjects covered, there is something there for everybody, including you. You'll be able to go there and find people to fellowship with, to communicate with, possibly learn something from, and be entertained and appreciate. And that which exists there that you don't have an interest, let it exist. It doesn't need your negative opinion expressed of it. Just find the joy in what you find joy in. But there's so many people who can't do that. You know, they walk in.
Well, they have to tear down other things, you know.
I love that, and that. They say, I hate all that stuff over there. And it's come on.
I mean, I'm all for kind of the coexisting sort of thing. Again, I don't have some of those interests, but I mean, a perfect example of that is back in 2019, I was working on the Lions of the East documentary, which was my look at the kind of mountain lion phenomenon in the Northeast. And I, happened to go to this event because I knew somebody who was kind of organizing it. It was sort of a ghost paranormal themed event in New Hampshire. And they were like, well, hey, we want somebody that's more into the cryptid stuff. Do you want to come? And I did that. I had a table, and I happened to meet a guy who's interested in ghosts, but is a police officer in the state of Connecticut and witnessed a mountain lion crossing a road a few miles from where a very famous case in 2011 where a mountain lion was struck and killed an hour outside of New York City in urban Connecticut that had traveled all the way from South Dakota. It's a very landmark case.
Crazy?
There's been books written about it. So I wouldn't have met this guy. I interviewed him on the spot with my cell phone and put him in the documentary. I wouldn't have had any. There's my own mountain lion running back there.
Yeah.
But I wouldn't have been in touch with him if I had decided to go to this ghost event, which not my cup of tea. And another thing I wanted to say was, comparing you and Seth obviously come from, well, you came from perspective of having a sighting kind of before you got into this, whereas
Sure.
Seth, he was into the subject and had this experience. I've never seen anything I can claim as a Sasquatch, but I've seen a UFO. But I'm not necessarily interested in that subject. But I used to be more, I don't want to say, kind of scoffing at it, but I had really no interest at all in these sort of ghost UFO stuff until I saw what I could only describe as UFO, by definition, unidentified flying object. I mean, maybe it was secret government technology, but I just found that ironic that, I was primarily, it was in Pennsylvania. I was in an area that I was interested in the Bigfoot stuff, and the UFO is what we ended up seeing. And it was, I was with guys who were UFO people, and they said this was the craziest UFO they've ever seen, and they've been into it for a while. And I'm still not as interested in the UFO topic as not nearly as much as Sasquatch or other creatures. So
I think one of those reasons though is you're like me in the fact that I like to operate in tighter parameters and what could be.
Right.
I do have a creative imagination, and I am pretty open-minded to a lot of different things. But when we're talking about Sasquatch, what it could be and what it couldn't be, there's a lot tighter parameters around that than when we're talking about UFOs and where do they come from? What do they look like? How many different kinds could there be? Why would they be? I mean, the parameters are so loose around
Right.
that yet is which to be answered that it's almost like how could anybody say you're wrong about something? I mean, nobody's wrong in that, right?
Right. But it's interesting. Not only that, I mean, because, and this is, people get really aggressive about, the flesh and blood versus the paranormal Sasquatch theories, right? And I've kind of, over the years, having spoken to so many people who have claimed to have had experiences, kind of come to the realization, well, whatever it is, even if it is, in my opinion, it is flesh and blood, it is some sort of undiscovered creature, relic hominid, something like that. But even if it is paranormal, it's still clearly leaving physical tracks, interacting with its environment, an interdimensional thing. I don't understand why, even if it is interdimensional, it's still throwing rocks at you, whatever that means. You could still track it potentially. So whatever it is, I think it still interacts in a physical plane, but people seem so either on one side or the other. And, I'm obviously more, as I said, more on one side, and just through sheer number of folks that I've talked to, a vast majority of them have described something that seems to be acting in a normal way. It was crossing the road, or it was running away. There's a very small minority of reports where there's an orb involved, or there's lights or other strange phenomena. So that's just been my experience. And as you said earlier too, I mean, that's just how it's kind of been. I mean, unless I'm able to witness it myself or document it some other way, I'm going to operate in the assumption that I'm looking for something that can be found in some way or another.
Well, you bring up an interesting point in that, to be somebody who is involved in this community and actively involved in field research and investigating and trying to uncover truths to this, for somebody who hasn't encountered something that you could definitely label as, I believe that was Sasquatch, that would, when I look at that, I mean, I kind of feel like by default, I don't get to choose whether or not I believe in Sasquatch.
Right.
My encounter threw me in that box, whether I wanted to be in it or not. But had I never had that encounter, there would be some frustrating days right now. I mean, if I was to be involved in research at the level that I was over the past year and at the level I plan to be over the coming year, when you look at the state of the community and some of the communication, the failure to communicate that happens,
Yeah.
and I would just be like, dude, what? This isn't worth it, right? I mean, what really drives me is trying to get to a point to where I have a better understanding of what happened that day and what that was. But yet, from your perspective, like you say, there is enough trace evidence that's left out there that you can't discount it. When you
No,
look at
yeah.
that have dermal ridges, when there's just so much out there, and let alone from the thousands and thousands upon encounters, many from very credible sources, you just can't discount it. I mean, you're stuck. I think at the least admitting that there's something there that you just can't turn your head on.
Yeah, I would agree. I mean, a part of it as well is I've had experiences that I can't confirm are Sasquatch, nor will I claim to, but seem to fit the purported behavior of the Sasquatch. So, in terms of the wood knocking and the rock throwing and some of the vocalizations and things that, once you eliminate the known suspects, it becomes kind of unusual because you can't classify exactly what it is, but it does seem to fit those traits. And another thing is, when you have some of this kind of frustrations with the community, people online, just the insanity that goes on, the hoaxes, it can be discouraging. But I've noticed over time, whenever that sort of thing has happened, I'll go through phases where, I lose some interest in certain aspects, but then I'll get a report or somebody in my local area in particular. This happened a number of times up here in New Hampshire. Somebody will send me an email and then I give them a call. It turns into a long conversation about their experience. And that reminds me, well, this is why I'm interested, because these people have true stories. They're not all lying. Some of them really are risking career positions. I mean, seeming credible by even telling you their story. And like the example with the cabin as well in Alaska, that was kind of an out of the blue email. Ended up talking to the guy and have become acquaintances with him and friends now, and realizing there's something going on here, whatever it is. I mean, it's interesting enough that I'm willing to go basically risk my life in Alaska to try and substantiate, and take a crew along with myself and others. And that's sort of the pursuit. That's really kind of the stuff that keeps me going, especially as those folks that confide in you, their stories in maybe ways that they haven't with others because of fear of ridicule and that sort of thing. So the human aspect of it it's like a double-edged kind of sword sort of thing. It's great on the one hand because you have all these people that are willing to tell you their stories and the patterns you can notice, but then you have on the other side the people that are arguing online. And I say, well, Bigfoot's not online; it's going to be out there. So we're wasting time with this. I mean, we do get caught up in it sometimes, but it's just part of the whole thing. But a lot of people, I think, get burnt out, and I realize that happens, but they may not be in a position where they have people reaching out to them with authentic encounters and they're able to do a follow-up investigation. And that's, the position we've been put in with that has been amazing because we really do get a lot of these very interesting stories that are worth following up or worth looking into a little bit. So I'm super thankful for that.
Yeah. Yeah. No, I would agree that there are, it's just a matter of, letting your peripheral see that which motivates you. I mean, if you're just looking straight ahead, you could say, I don't like the state of affairs the way it feels today or this week or this past month. I've seen people who I've looked up to in this community. I've seen people who I thought were credible. Now that I've seen them in, where I'm questioning something, open your eyes up in the peripheral and you'll see 100 reasons to keep moving forward and want to try to get to where we're moving this ball. If we're going to focus on that little bit that just discourages us, we just aren't going to get to the finish line. I mean, that's all there is to it.
Yeah, just ignore it. I mean, forget the drama and look like especially like I said in local areas. Look into some cases in your local area. Do a deep dive on the history about the environment. And let's say an area like here where I'm in New Hampshire, some of the areas that I've had that as research areas 200 years ago were clear cuts in someone's farm. Now this area is supporting moose and black bear and just about every other forest critter we have, and that's a change. So is it possible
Yeah.
that maybe if moose and other large animals return, could Sasquatches potentially then habit, an area or habitate an area that previously was unfeasible just a few hundred years ago? Do a deep dive in their local area or local reports, talk to a local researcher or something like that, because I mean, there's plenty of reasons to be interested. You don't have to focus on the drama of the week or the crazy allegation by somebody looking for attention that's trying to stir up drama. Focus on what is important to you in the topic. That's again, that's for me has been, it happens coincidentally, but also purposefully if you just need to, get out of that sort of analysis mode and look into something else.
I'm kind of the opinion that I could, when you're passionate about something and you have the drive to try to understand something or get answers to something, it'd be very, very difficult to walk away or abandon whatever it is that's motivating you. You could say I quit. But the first time you're going to open up an email from somebody that says, look, I live an hour away from you. I've got this happening on my property. Can you help me? I'm like, where's my freaking boots, man?
Exactly. Yeah.
I could do it without doing it on YouTube. I could say, hey, look, I'm sick of the YouTube stuff, or I'm sick of the, some of the infighting and stuff that takes place in the community. And you could walk away from that online public part of it, but your drive to keep going and trying to get answers would always be there,
Yeah, go incognito mode. I mean, I've got stuff that I work on behind the scenes that's just related to my personal interest on the topic, or even other topics that I find are sort of adjacent that, I don't think it's really public worthy. It's just something that interests me. I'll draw up a sheet and kind of make those connections and just try and see if there's any place this will lead me eventually. And hey, sometimes it'll be interesting enough that, man, I could turn this into like a YouTube investigation, but it doesn't have to necessarily be that way. It can just be your own personal investigation that then becomes part of your file of research, something that you can, if you're on another case, draw on, if there's any parallels or anything. So there's tons of ways to go about it. But I think people really get caught up with some of the drama and that sort of stuff. But that's just any community. I mean, I'm involved in other hobbies too, and it's the same thing,
There's all kinds. I mean, listen, if you've got a kid that's in Boy Scouts or you've got a kid that's on the local baseball team, the coach is going to say, hey, I need some parents that are willing to help out. It's always the same 2 or 3 parents helping. And it's always the same 7 or 8 parents that say, I don't want to get involved. And, that dynamic exists everywhere. There's people that are out there doing stuff, and there's other people that are sitting back watching what's being done and expressing their opinion on it. And if you're one of the doers, don't focus on the negative opinion. I mean, that's all there is to it. Yeah. For every 10 people that are going to pat you on the back saying, dude, I appreciate you. I appreciate the work that you're doing, or the way that you share things, or even if it's just, I just find it entertaining,
Right.
You're going to hear 1 or 2 people that say, you're an idiot. You're a liar. You're whatever. You've got to discount that. I mean,
especially with the negativity. I mean, if you're especially on YouTube, you get a lot of hate your way for sure. Just for even if you're trying to be very level-headed and rational, someone's going to find fault or go on some crazy rant. And I used to get kind of not upset, but it would affect you. You'd say, "Oh man, is everything I'm doing garbage? Like, is this person right?" But then you have to realize that a lot of these people haven't really done anything. That if they're tearing you down, that might mean that they're not all, something may be wrong with them, and it just feels better to tear others down. But I'll try to find the most crazy, vulgar, or insane comments and just trying to laugh at them and use them almost as fuel. I mean, we've gotten some great ones that you could practically, I was talking to Cliff about it, at the CryptidCon in Kentucky recently, and we had some crazy comments, and he's like, that's something you could probably put on a shirt. It's just a really funny quote from some horrible trolling online. But yeah, I think it's just part of it, is learning to deal with that, especially if you're in the public eye. That's definitely something you have to deal with. And just people disagreeing with you. It's totally fine for people to disagree with you, to a degree. If they're vulgar and just insulting you based on your character, ad hominem attack, I think they've probably already lost the debate. But that's a story for another day.
Yeah, I think that there's, it's just an understanding that, one, we went over just the other day, we went over the analytics of what our channel and what the network's been doing on YouTube and on all the podcast platforms. And what was interesting is that our podcast listens are about 8-1 over what our YouTube views are. And you can break that down into analytics where, like surprisingly, like 82% of our podcast listeners are males between 42 and 63 years old or something like that. You can really get an understanding of this, but you need to understand that when you see somebody acting up in chat, or they have a problem with whatever you're talking about, that's one person, right?
Yeah.
Out of the 42,000 people who listened on podcasts this month, who have no interactive way to tell anybody what their opinion is, they're listening on their way to work, or they're listening while they're at work,
Maybe they'll throw a thumbs up,
and they're coming back week after week, listening over and over because they have become a fan, or they appreciate what they're hearing. I appreciate those people. It's really easy to hop on YouTube and get in the chat and tell me I'm an idiot, but YouTube is such an interactive, really to some degree, an anonymous way to express your opinions, whether you want to do so in a mature way or a not so mature way. And, people are going to exercise that in different ways, but I don't want to go off on that. It's just something that I've noticed lately on different channels. And, I guess there's some truth to everybody loves a train wreck, right? They're going to show up if they think there's going to be one. I always thought my show was kind of boring when it came to the train wrecks. I wasn't trying to do the 3-ring circus thing. I'm not titling shows, I shot a Bigfoot with my BB gun, and, it's just the nuts and bolts and the techniques and the things that the theories we develop. And there are people who find that there's a niche of people who are really interested in that, but it's not everybody's cup of tea. Some people just want the train wreck. They want, they want to be entertained. So
yeah, I think it's all part of it, the online aspect of it. And, the stuff people might say on YouTube is not what they would say on Facebook. They don't have the anonymity perhaps they might on Facebook. But like you said, I think the majority of people, especially, it's the loud minority you hear from. It's those the loud vocal ones that are making fun of you or doing whatever kind of stupid comment just because they can. Well, as you're going to have 10-1 people that aren't going to leave a comment, that maybe won't even leave a thumbs up, but that like what you've done, but they're just not going to admit that. They're not going to say that because, as you said, they're maybe busy or they don't have time to comment. Whereas somebody who has time to comment and trash you on a YouTube page, they probably have a little more time on their hands than you do, and that most people do. So, but anyway, off with the trolls.
Here's Randy saying, "Are we
not entertained?"
I think I'm glad. Are you not entertained?
right. Classic.
But, there is. What was I going to say? I think that there's probably a large amount of people who really are here in this community to try to educate and learn. And I think it's easy to get blind to that because we see the same 20, 30 names in chat and we kind of feel like our circle is what it is. And it would be easy to be blind to the thousands that listen in podcasts or those who are here right watching that choose not to type anything,
Right.
Maybe they aren't the majority. Even if the majority was here just to be entertained by the Sasquatch subject, those who are here trying to learn what they can about it or trying to get the courage to step forward and share an experience that's happened to them. They're gleaning that courage from that which they see in this community. And I think if we're mindful of that, that we would maybe approach it a little bit differently with the way we word things and the way we say things. And I don't mean we as in everybody, but how some people would, But
That's interesting.
The Jimmy, was it the Jimmy Kimmel, one of the late night hosts, would roast themselves by sharing comments that were made on Twitter. They were so outlandish, the shots people would take.
I think they did that with different celebrities, and they would have them read tweets to themselves.
Oh,
that's pretty amazing. But
it's funny. I feel like that could be done here, right?
Oh, it could.
Let's get Cliff on and have Cliff share all the emails that he's got.
Or
tried to rip him apart.
Truly, I mean, like I was saying, that Cliff has suggested putting it on a shirt. How negative some of these comments are. They're just so comically bizarre at some point. So they'll be barely coherent, barely literate, and it's somehow insulting you for being stupid, whatever, sounding like a dummy in the comment. But
you're so stupid, and they'll spell it STOOPID.
I mean, we with this first part of the Alaskan Coastal Sasquatch, we're approaching 700,000 views just within the first 2 weeks, essentially at this point. And what we've noticed, with the analytics is that most people are finding the video through browse features. So they're not even necessarily coming from the Bigfoot community. So I've noticed a lot of folks that we've seen coming from outside of that. They'll have very inquisitive questions, or they'll ask stuff in the comments that normally, you wouldn't really get, because you've got the same type of people they kind of know this. Maybe they've heard this repeated many times. And then we'll also get the crazy ones, of course, who think we're all dumb for still looking for something that hasn't been proven yet. But the point being is that it's going beyond just the Bigfoot community, which I actually enjoy a lot of talking to folks that aren't in the community, especially in the outdoors world, whether it be backpacking or hiking or hunting forums and Facebook pages, especially locally. I've gotten great reports just from local groups where people sometimes will even post, anyone have any weird stories while backpacking in the White Mountains? And then you look through the deluge. There's the people that see the weird lights. Then there's, I saw this hairy man run across the trail. He was 8 feet tall, that kind of stuff. And that leads you down some pretty interesting paths. So kind of like we were talking about with the conferences, it's very similar in the sense that we're getting people who maybe normally wouldn't see one of our videos or see anything we've done or even be associated with Bigfoot. Maybe they're just looking for Alaska stuff and they're like, oh, let me click on this. And then they kind of come into this and we might get some new information. They may post, well, I had this happen to me, or whatever the case may be. So there's just so many other, outside of the Bigfoot community, there's just so many other facets and communities and overlaps and that sort of thing.
I see it often with the network of hunting guides that I work with. And I'll often ask them, have you ever seen or had any experiences that you can't explain as far as being able to chalk it up to something that should exist out there? Almost everything that I hear, I can say it's wolves. It's, there's a plausible explanation that makes sense.
Right.
Have you ever ran into something that you didn't have the plausible explanation that makes sense? And when I ask them that, you can see in their eyes that they're thinking, man,
should I tell this story?
I don't know. You're going to think I'm crazy. And I'm looking at it with my eyes trying to say, dude, I don't think you're crazy. Say it, man. Go ahead
tell
and
me.
let it rip, right?
I will keep bugging you for weeks if you do not tell me now. I've had it happen too. It's amazing, just seeing people that maybe were even kind of poo-pooing the idea a minute ago. And then we're like, well, I did get rocks thrown at me one time out in the woods or whatever the case may be. So yeah, I think it's interesting, when people, again, it comes back to that not wanting to seem crazy, where even though you're telling them, that, hey, I'm into the Bigfoot stuff, they still don't want to be judged. They may think, oh, you're going to turn them into a circus clown. And this happens with a lot of the interviews too, where, I've even spoken to people who have previously maybe been interviewed by, a TV show or something like that, and they've almost been burned. They're very skeptical of doing anything else on camera because of the way they were treated by a local newscast or, like a bigger production, right? So it's just interesting the way people cope and deal with those sorts of things, and when they're willing to open up to you or not.
Well, and another thing that I'm also amazed by is, and it speaks to the fact that it shouldn't be easy to just go out and have an encounter if you
Right.
think you're going to create a situation, because I'm talking about dozens upon dozens of guides that I'm close to. And I'm not talking about guys who just go out and hunt, bring their friends hunting or guide one or two people. I'm talking about guides who spend 100+ days a year.
Right.
I mean, literally a third of the year in remote wilderness in Montana and Idaho and Manitoba and Saskatchewan. These guys in remote areas that are just stupid off the grid with one or two people at a time. And they do this, they've done it for decades, and they've never had
anything. Yeah.
Never had anything. So, I mean, this idea that, oh man, you go out there, if you do this, it'll probably happen. No, it probably won't. I mean, it shouldn't be this idea that's why I'm really glad that I had my encounter before I really knew anything about the subject, really, because it drove me to want to understand more and learn more and research. But also, I see people who now are in the field a lot, and they have an idea that I'm starting to understand this, and if I go out and do this, it's likely that this will happen. It's not likely. It's very, very hard. When you look at people like Randy Harrington and Shane Carpenter and their property, the 400, I mean, it isn't that they are really good at something, and they'd probably be the first to tell you that. Has nothing to do with how good they are at something. It has to do with them finding a spot that connects an A to a B for a certain, group in which it keeps getting traveled, and they've somehow arrived at that timeline, the right timing, the right point in their lives, the right understanding, and it just came together. And if you were to dissect that and say, how easy is it to reproduce that? It's not. It's not.
Yeah. I think that's definitely a part of it. I mean, as you mentioned, I've talked to so many outdoorsmen that, oh, you really think there's Bigfoot? Well, I've been hunting since I was a kid in whatever area they may have been in, never ever had anything happen. But then I've talked to folks that they've been out 30, 40 years, and then all of a sudden, if they're in their 50s and they have a sighting of something that, if you had told them at any point in their life before, they wouldn't have known. But I think coming down to the areas, I mean, I try to do the math. In the 2 years we've been doing Bigfoot Beyond the Trail, we've averaged about 40 to 45 to 50 days in the field. And that includes production time. So that includes interviewing folks. But really, I mean, we've spent 2 weeks essentially camping at times, like when we were in the Pacific Northwest last summer. So we get out there a fair amount of times in areas that are allegedly kind of hotspots and not had things happen. We've had some things happen, but not nearly as much as you'd expect if these things were everywhere. But I think the benefit of the position, as researchers we're in, is that we can get somebody that tells us, well, hey, I have this remote property where I have this and this going on, and you kind of work through the case. So that's saving me the effort of spending, I could spend a lifetime just driving a boat up and down the Kenai Peninsula trying to find an area, because anywhere you look could be suitable.
And there
for
are
Sasquatch,
those that have. I mean, when you see somebody say, here's a video of something that I captured, I'll tell you what, there was 1 million boats just over the last 3 or 4 years that went up and down that shoreline and never saw anything.
It's either pure chance or you get directed into a spot like we did with the Alaska cabin. I mean, we've even been to other properties that people in Colorado, we went to a place and we didn't really experience a whole lot. I mean, we heard a lot of the stories that this family was experiencing out there, but again, as researchers, we have the benefit of getting people reaching out to us and letting us know about their spots that they may have already had years of activity at. So that makes our job a lot easier in terms of just getting out there and trying out things to see if we might be able to get anything definitive. But I mean, it's all part of it. Again, I think luck is a big part of this. And luck and preparation are two of the things that I
Yeah,
think are
yeah,
very crucial with this
yeah.
topic.
Yeah, you shouldn't let the idea that regardless of how unlikely it is that you can create an opportunity somehow to have an experience, it doesn't mean you shouldn't be prepared for it to happen. Because,
Right.
and Randy brings up a good point. I mean, Randy Harrington, I was just talking about him and Shane
That's a
Carpenter.
great
He
point.
says,
Yeah.
think of how many prospectors and cowboys, he says, and trappers who slept out on open ground and had nothing happened, or never correctly interpreted what
That's
they
a big
may have
one.
experienced.
Yep.
I mean, you think about it, we're talking centuries of people coming across this country, whether they were building the railroad or whether they were chasing a dream on a gold rush or just trying to settle someplace and escape something. I mean, they came out on a remote. I mean, we don't have to talk about how remote was it. It was all remote back then.
It was no
And
joke.
they didn't have stories to tell about. I mean, there's a lot of things they probably had stories about, but Sasquatch just didn't end up in that narrative for so many.
Yeah, I mean, unless there were maybe perhaps a spectacular story. You've got, of course, the Bauman story with supposedly Teddy Roosevelt, and then, of course, stuff like
Sure.
Ape Canyon,
Mhm.
Albert Osman. You know, if those stories are true, they stick out because of the spectacular nature of them.
Sure.
But so many of the folks I've talked to as well that aren't into the Bigfoot topic, well, I started, and this is something I've noticed with people that either they live on a property, like I had a case in New Hampshire here, where the guy was noticing stuff happening over time, but he just sort of disregarded them. He's saying, okay,
Yeah.
whatever. I heard a wood knock. A rock pebble kind of fell. I didn't think much of it. It wasn't until he got a rock thrown at the screen window in front of his face as he's looking outside that he actually kind of got concerned and started thinking about things. And another guy, he owned his family owned some land, and they would do, in one section they would grow trees for Christmas trees, tree farm. They had a tree farm, so he's like, I've heard wood do everything in the books, but one day I was out there and we heard this rhythmic, loud knocking pattern. I knew it was, hitting the side of a cedar tree. Like, he was down to the specifics. The guy knew his trees. He said, I've never heard trees do that. I've heard them flex and pop, but I've never heard knocks or anything like that. So I find that interesting too. Whereas before that, the idea of wood knocks probably would have been laughable to this guy.
Well, and if you think about it, what you mentioned earlier, when it comes to Roosevelt and all these documented accounts, they were there documenting for a different purpose. They were documenting everything that happened to them. And somehow when they experienced something that they couldn't explain, it found its way into that documentary. People, if you were to ask me, tell me about your great, 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 great grandfather, I couldn't tell you what his favorite food was. I couldn't tell you where he was born. I couldn't tell you what his favorite color. I don't know anything about that guy. Right. So, I mean, the idea that, Roosevelt wrote about it. Yeah, there was probably hundreds of people who may have had an experience, but guess what? They weren't writing about anything.
Yeah.
And even if they told their kid and their kid told their kid, somewhere in the last 17 generations, we forgot about it. It got lost somewhere.
I mean, mass literacy is a common thing now, but 200 years ago, not everyone knew how to read or write. So, I mean, you may have somebody that, especially guys living off the land, they don't have the need for a vocabulary or to write and read books. They were, hey, I'm a trapper, I'm a logger, this is what I do. I'm probably going to die getting crushed by a log or, mauled by a bear or something like that. I have no need to write books. So they may have had tons of experiences, but we're never going to know that for the most part. There's so many. So it's just, again, coming down to those human experiences and the way that people convey them. And I've talked to folks who know people in the logging industry, for example, up in Maine, which is, Maine is the most forested state in the country, tons of loggers. And they've talked about specifically guys that have had experiences wait till they retire to talk about their experiences.
Yeah.
Because the last thing they want to do is, he's the Bigfoot logger. He becomes the butt of all the jokes. Guy, wait 20 years to tell his story. And then finally, hey, I no longer have to worry about the social pressure and I can share what I experienced. It may be mind-blowing to us, but it's largely useless because it's just a story. I mean, if we'd gotten into at the day after reported, at least you could get out there and maybe look for trace evidence or any kind of other secondary evidence. But with the social pressures that exist, that just isn't the case, especially for folks like that.
Yeah, no, I agree. Well, I tell you, Alex, I appreciate you joining us tonight. As usual, I love our conversations. I really do. I also love how interactive our chat gets with their conversation, because it's interesting. I go on a lot of different channels, and you'll see where the conversation going on in chat has nothing to do with what's being talked about on the show. It's like its own separate world over there. And
everyone's just kind of
people. I see
other
people in our
conversations.
chat here week after week where their conversations are running parallel with what we're talking about. So it tells me that, the guests that we get on and the conversation, things we talk about do seem to be interesting to others. And I never have to doubt whether that will be the case if I'm having you on. So
awesome. Well, again, thanks for having me on, and I'm glad we could get Seth on as well.
Oh yeah,
it's always awesome because him and I, we're doing our independent projects that will have overlap at times, but they're completely different. The way we, he structures how he's going to do a film, whereas I don't even know how it's going to happen until I'm in the editing bay.
Sure.
Seeing where it takes me, what direction it takes me based off the footage I have. So it's really cool to kind of hear that, and we share a lot of the same ideas, but we do things differently. And
it's interesting that
to get that perspective.
He's putting together a project that, through the encounters, through the stories, through the timeline, it could span a century or more.
Right.
And yet what you're doing is like this snippet, this little snapshot of that timeline. It's like, this is just boom, right?
If you zoomed in on one of the stories, this is the stuff that's happened just in the past few years, not very contemporary. I think that's how I've kind of described it even before with what, in particular with this one, what he's doing is just that zoom out look at the whole Alaska Bigfoot kind of phenomenon. And then what we're doing is a more contemporary boots on the ground sort of thing, which is what a lot of these cases are, but no one ever investigates them or looks into them. So that's kind of what we're hoping to do.
I think sometime after January 17th, by then, Christmas Day, we'll have the second part of Alaska Coastal Sasquatch out. We'll have January 17th. Sounds like he's releasing that documentary. So maybe in that week or so following that, we'll get you both back on again if it works for his schedule, because I would like to talk about that parallel now that everybody's kind of seen it,
Sure. Yeah, absolutely. I think that's a great idea.
Would be interesting. So
let us know. Yeah, it works for me.
Well, I will be talking to you before Christmas, but
for sure.
You have a great holiday, and enjoy the time that you're back at home here until the next adventure starts, right?
January rolls and the new year begins. We're going to have our hands full for sure. So enjoying it for now.
You bet. Well, you have an awesome rest of your week, and I look forward to talking to you again here soon.
Absolutely. Thanks again for having me on, Jeff.
You bet. Well, I don't know what you guys thought, but boy, I love listening to Seth share his perspective of the encounters and the things that are shared with him, the way that they're shared with him, and the efforts that they go through to put themselves in the position to be able to communicate with people who have had those experiences. Also, anybody who's seen the first part of this documentary that Alex put out, I know we're all glued to the edge of our seats waiting for Christmas morning so we can get the kids up, tell them to open those darn presents so we can turn on the TV and watch part 2. So I'm excited. I know you guys are excited. And on the back side of that, I'm also excited to have both Seth and Alex back and talk to them about the feedback they've gotten on it all. So you guys take care. Click the subscribe if you're new here. If you want to join us again, maybe give us one more shot at capturing your attention. I'd appreciate that. If you liked the show and liked the guests that we had and you're excited to see more, go ahead and click the like button. I will thank you in advance for that too. And until next week, Everybody take care. We will